Hello and welcome to the first in a series of lessons on the poem Ozymandias, which is written by Percy Shelley. This is a poem which you will study as part of your GCSE English literature, and all of the poems that you will study are focused around the themes of power and conflict. I'll be asking you to pause the video at various moments to complete notes and then start the video again. Make sure you are completing your 20 minutes of silent reading a day and that you have an appropriate reading book. So yes, now pause the video and complete this reading. So in the lesson today we will be focusing on the context surrounding both Percy Shelley himself and of course his poem Ozymandias. By context we mean looking at factors which influence the writing of the poem and obviously influence the poet as well. So Percy Shelley was a romantic poet, and although he only really became famous after his death, the romantic movement or romanticism really did have a huge influence on art, literature in the late 1700s to the late 18th century and the early and even into the majority of the 1800s, so the 19th century. I want you to have a look at all of the images on this slide and the following slides and make a list and make some notes about from looking at these images, what kind of things do you think the romantic movement was concerned with? What kind of things essentially was romanticism about? What did these writers and artists focus on? Hopefully you have got a long list of features of relevant areas of the romantic movement. The Romantics had some really strong beliefs which shaped all of their work, their writing and their artwork as well. And they really believed in emotion rather than reason. And this came as a contrast to everything that happened in society before this period of time. They were really interested in capturing personal experience in their work and making things really relevant for individuals. One of the big things that they focused on was the power of nature, which we see in this poem Ozymandias. And one of the other poems that you will study, the Prelude by William Wordsworth, also focuses on the power of nature and the impact that it has on individual man and how it's something that should be revered and really celebrated. They also believed in the power of the sublime and the power of the supernatural, and that these were things that we should take note of. They were really against traditional institutions of power, such as the monarchy, and they tried to show in their writing that they were against these things. I started to talk about how Percy Shelley was against the system. Have a look at the series of images that you can see on this slide and make a note of what kind of things you think that Shelley opposed, and therefore what kind of things he was likely to be writing about in his poetry. So when we talk about Percy Shelley being against the system, we mean him disliking the monarchy, for example. This is particularly important because his radical political views were inspired by the events of the French Revolution, where the monarchy was actually overthrown, was taken over by the ordinary people in France who had just had enough of the tyranny of the power, the rule and the cruelty that had been forced on them by the monarchy for a number of years. He also hated absolute power, which again could be seen in government. He disliked the oppression, the mistreatment of ordinary people. And you can see on the slide things like slavery, people being wrongly killed, and suffering such as starvation. So we've learned a bit about the poet Percy Shelley. And obviously things that influenced him to write this poem, but I want to focus now a bit on what the subject matter actually is. And Shelley wrote Ozymandias in 1817 after hearing about how an Italian explorer had retrieved a statue from the desert. And the statue was of Ramesses II, who was also known as Ramesses the Great, and was also known as Ozymandias, and that's where the title of the poem comes from. He was the third pharaoh, so an Egyptian king from the 19th dynasty in Egypt. He's often regarded as the greatest, most celebrated, most powerful. Obviously, we're really concerned with power in the study of these poems. The most powerful pharaoh of that kingdom, and in one of the most powerful periods of history itself, of the history itself of ancient Egypt. So yes, as I said, he is the subject of the poem. His statue, as I said, had been discovered, had been retrieved at the time that Shelley was writing, so in 1817. So obviously it was a very topical piece of information to reference in the poem. Ramesses II then was remembered for his tyranny, which means abuse of power, his military exploits, so he spent a lot of time giving orders and sending people to war. He had a large empire in Egypt, so obviously a lot of power in Egypt, but he's also remembered for his defeats and his failures, and whether they've been military or in terms of management of his power. So what I want you to do is, again, look at the images on the next slide and think about what kind of ruler Ramesses II was. So here, as I said, have a look at the pictures and make some notes. What kind of person, what kind of ruler was Ramesses II? So Ramesses II had many wives and many children. As I said before, he led many military campaigns which weren't always very successful. He was a very vain person, and he had many statues and buildings commissioned during his time in power, and actually a lot of those were of himself, as you can see that in the previous slide. And he did rule with absolute power. He was a leader who felt a great sense of pride in what he'd achieved. He calls in the poem on other rulers to admire what he did. He had a huge sense of arrogance. He believes that he believes he's the most powerful ruler in the land. Nobody can compete with him. And obviously he has he believes he has a huge amount of power. And next lesson, when we look at the poem itself, we'll see what's important about that power, and is it he believes this power is everlasting, but is it actually everlasting? So we'll see these things that he, information about him, we will see next lesson in the poem itself. Okay, so to finish, I'd like you to do some of your own research on Percy Shelley. Can you add some more information to your notes? Can you find out some more information about him? Why not try thinking about researching who he was married to, and what influence that had, who his friends were, and anything else that you can find that you think is important about him. Thank you, and you will find the next video for lesson 2 on the poem Ozymandias, which will focus on what the poem is actually about. Thank you.